I grew up in a single-parent household, just me, my sister, and my mom, with my grandpa occasionally lending a hand with parenting duties. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, we were broken into twice. I didn't know all the details of the whole thing until years later. I have vague memories of moving apartments and some cops coming over to the house, but I was pretty much kept in the dark until I was old enough to handle what had gone down. For the first break-in, we were all out grocery shopping, so my mom didn't realize anything had happened until we got home. There was an open window, open drawers. The way my grandpa tells it, it's like my mom interrupted them in the middle of doing something, and they climbed out of a second-floor window as soon as he'd heard us arrive. That or whoever it was just didn't care about people knowing he'd been there. The second break-in happened 3 months later. Only this time, the guy broke in at nighttime while we were all asleep. I had to get all this from my grandpa because, understandably, my mom hates talking about it. But the way he tells it, she basically woke up in the middle of the night and sensed a presence in the room with her. Not like a spirit or anything dumb like that, like an actual person. Then when she opened her eyes, there was someone standing next to her bed with something shiny in his hand. She told Grandpa she was literally frozen with terror, couldn't move, couldn't talk, literally petrified in the very sense of the word. Apparently, the guy was mumbling something. Mom couldn't remember exactly what. Then by the time she started begging him not to hurt her, she couldn't hear anything at all. My sister remembers walking into her room, thinking that she was having a nightmare. She asked Mom if she was okay. Mom threw the covers from over her head, saw the guy was gone, then noticed the second-floor window was open where the guy had used the same escape route as the first break-in. She put my little sister back to bed. I obviously have no memory of this because I was asleep. She called 911. Then she called my grandpa. Grandpa said the cops found faint, muddy footprints all over the house, including in our bedrooms, so he'd obviously taken his time exploring the place before he'd woken my mom up. Only this guy hadn't just been exploring. He'd been very, very busy, and it actually took us a few days to uncover all the bizarre little things he'd done. Things which spoke to just how insane this person really was. The next day, when we noticed that the cat wouldn't touch her milk, Mom poured it out into the sink, thinking that it had gone sour, then got the distinct smell of bleach as she did so. She can't be certain, but she thinks the guy poured bleach into the cat's milk, wanting to kill it. Then there was the cracked empty eggs in the fridge, not like cracked all the way, just little holes in the top with all the yolk and egg white missing. It's possible he just poured them down the sink, but Grandpa thinks the guy might have been sucking them raw. Not all that scary, I know, just freaky, you know. Mom says some meat was missing from the fridge too, raw meat, but I know Grandpa used to feed our cat from the fridge too, so we can't rule that out. A few days later, Grandpa came over in the evening for some dinner and offered to help prep for garbage day. He says one of the garbage cans is split right as he got into the driveway, complains to my mom about tin cans in the garbage or whatever, and then goes on the cleanup and finds what spilled it. Someone, presumably the guy who broke in, had thrown a pair of scissors in the trash, along with a clothing catalog he'd been cutting up. He cut the heads off almost every single model in that catalog, and the little paper heads were nowhere to be found. My grandpa thinks the guy took them as some kind of trophy, but who knows what he really did with them. Then there was the salt in my mom's work shoes, the knife missing from her knife block in the kitchen. Obviously, the shiny thing he'd been holding when she woke up to him in her room. Anyway, the cops got plenty of fingerprints, but whoever it was didn't have a record, and other than the muddy boot prints they found, there was nothing much to go on. So to this day, no one's been arrested for it, but my grandpa thinks he knows who it was. Years later, after we moved apartments twice in a bid to avoid the guy, a friend of a distant relative ended up getting locked up in some kind of psychiatric hospital. The guy had become obsessed with Alice in Wonderland, had all the books, multiple copies of them too, and all he ever talked about was the Looking Glass or Wonderland, and all this stuff. It might just be a complete coincidence, But the thing is, that's my mom's name, Alice. She's over the whole thing now. It's been more than 20 years since all of that. But I know that if she doesn't like talking about it even today, it had to have messed her up for a while. I'm 21 years old, a girl in college. This started when I was 20, at the beginning of 2018 to be exact. It was about 2:00 a.m., and I had just gone downstairs to get a midnight snack. I sat down at the kitchen island after making myself a plate of nachos and turned on some YouTube as I always do. After about 20 minutes of this, I was in the process of choosing my next video when I got the sudden urge to look towards the living room. As I did, a large, dark, black figure seemingly floated past the hallway towards the front door area. Its head almost skimmed the ceiling, making it over 7 feet tall. It resembled the Grim Reaper, wearing a hooded cloak that went the length of its body down to the floor. But it wasn't carrying any type of scythe or weapon, not that I could see. Most people would have been freaked out, would have been scared at least. But to be honest, the only thing that went through my head was, whoa, that happened. Then I went back to eating and watching my video. I've seen enough horror films to come to this conclusion. The second you want to snitch about something, that's when you get trapped in your house or mysteriously killed. So, I wasn't going to say anything out loud or bring it up to anyone, or even show any signs that I acknowledged it. Fast forward a couple of weeks later. There's no more activity for now. At around 6 o'clock one evening, though I was home alone. Both parents were on work-related trips. I was lying on my stomach in my bed, playing some game on my phone. There was no music for the game, as I had my phone on silent. That's when I heard it, as clear as day, coming just from the other side of my closed bedroom door, a very demonic male voice. I froze for a moment. I could clearly tell that not only did the voice come from the other side of the door, but whatever called out my name was bent down and spoke right through the gap in the bottom. The same thought went through my head again. Just ignore it, and it won't do anything to you. I went back to playing my game, quickly forgetting that it even happened, until something a little bit more creepy started happening. It had been a month or two since the previous incident, and I had completely forgotten about the thing I started calling Shadow Demon. I woke up on a lazy Saturday morning. I was too lazy to actually open my eyes all the way and get up, so I stayed in bed, curled up in my blankets, listening to my music still playing on my phone from the night before. My eyes were closed, and I hadn't moved from my original waking position, lying completely still. I suddenly felt the corner of my bed being pushed in, like someone had placed their hand there, and began testing the firmness and bounciness of the bed. I immediately thought, he is back. So I laid totally still, not wanting to let it know that I was awake. And after a couple of minutes, my bed sunk down like someone had sat down on it. Now, I was actually kind of freaked out. This thing was watching me, supposedly sleep. What kind of creep does that? I thought, honestly trying to make myself feel better and more calm about the situation. After about 10 minutes, the weight finally lifted. This actually happened every morning for the next week or two. What really creeped me out, though, was that on the mornings where I didn't think it happened, I realized it probably did, and I had just slept through it. When it all died down again, nothing happened for another couple of months. I knew he came back, especially when he started sitting on the bed again. Only this time, he seemed like he was trying to wake me up by bouncing on the bed more violently. I stayed completely still again, just waiting for it to stop and go away so I could go out and get some food. The creepiness of it all had waned a bit. Fast forward, now in 2019, around late May, he'd stopped again for a few months. Then, he came back suddenly with a bang. I was laying in bed, minding my own business, and watching Netflix on the computer when something slapped the end of my bed extremely hard. It scared the heck out of me, and I almost smacked my phone off the bed in fright. I figured it was that shadow demon, so I ignored it and pretended it didn't even happen. I'm probably being stupid at this point, but I don't care. A week goes by, and I'm disturbed again. This time, something bumped itself against the bottom of my bed, as if there was something alive underneath it. Honestly, I tried not to chuckle at the thought of a huge demon accidentally smacking its head against a bed frame. Not much more has happened since then, except for my cat taking an odd liking to one corner of my room. The corner where, at one point, I swear to God, I saw something inhuman standing there, watching me. But that's the end of it for now. When things do happen, it's random. Some of it's creepy, and some of it unused. So, I've had quite a few bad experiences with strange people in my house from when I was young. An old man would come banging on our door late at night, demanding to see me, causing me to have to hide in the house. Or once, when a man came knocking on our door late at night with a knife, because he mistook our house for my neighbor's. These experiences all caused me to be very cautious about opening the front door to anyone, or even being in the house alone, especially at night. But one evening was definitely the worst. It was around 6:00 p.m. in November of 2018. I'm from England, meaning it was already pitch black outside at this time of the year. I had just gotten home from work and was sitting in my room upstairs, watching YouTube on my laptop. My mom shouted up to me that she was just going to pick my brother up from work and would be stopping off at the gas station on the way back, so she would be gone for a little bit. She asked if I wanted to come. I said no, and I carried on with my video. I heard her close the front door and pull out of the driveway. I was 17 at the time, so being home alone at night was nothing new to me, and I was used to the eerie feeling of it. But after around 10 minutes, I started hearing noises coming from downstairs. At first, I thought nothing of it, and just related it to my cat noisily searching for food in an empty bowl, until I remembered him sitting at the end of my bed. I paused my video and listened more. At the sound of banging on my back door, this instantly creeped me out, until it was followed by the sound of keys dangling. I thought, oh, my mom must have dropped my brother off before going to the station, and he's just trying to go outside. So I let the noise continue as I kept watching my video. He can get quite angry at times, so the loud banging was nothing out of the ordinary. But it just kept carrying on, banging, the sounds of keys dangling, then dropping, then banging again. Then the fear really hit me. I don't think it's him. I walked out of my room slowly and sat on the stairs, listening carefully to the noise. It definitely wasn't him. I'm an extremely anxious person, and everyone gets those late-night moments when they hear noises and immediately think the worst. This was just one of those, I told myself. So I decided to bite the bullet and just walk straight into the kitchen and face whatever it was that was causing the noise. Our kitchen has the door facing straight to the garden, but as I turned the corner into the kitchen, I heard a loud bang and the clatter of footsteps running away. The cat flap had been ripped off the door, and there was plastic from it everywhere. In fear, I still tried to console myself into thinking it could have been anything other than people breaking in. I sat back on the stairs and called my mom just to check again that it wasn't my brother home early and just in a bad mood. But then he answered my mom's phone while still in the car. "Are you home?" I shouted at him. Then my voice started to break with terror. "Please be serious. Are you home right now?" I asked. "No. What do you want?" He said. Even though he said he wasn't, I still begged in my mind that he was joking just to scare me. But he heard how scared I was and began to worry. I explained to him what happened, and he started to scream at me to call the police. He's never been the protective type, but I could tell now he was really worried, and told my mom to rush back home straight away while calling for the police. I tried so hard to stay calm. I told them exactly what was happening as I hid back in my room with the door tightly locked. Then I heard talking and the banging of doors downstairs again. They were back. I burst into tears to the dispatcher out of pure fear, and I sat on the phone for what felt like forever until my mom, brother, and police all pulled up at the same time. Everyone charged through the house to the back door, and we instantly saw what they had done. The people saw the keys to the back door on the side in the kitchen, took a broom from outside, broke it in half on the door handle, got the broom through the cat flap, knocked the keys off the side, and pulled them through the cat flap. Although out of pure luck as they broke the broom in half, they also managed to snap off the door handle, making it completely impossible for it to be opened from the outside. Otherwise, they would have gotten in, no questions asked, and I would have been sitting quietly in my room, completely oblivious. It was clear afterward that they had been watching the house for a while, waiting until the exact moment that they saw my mom's car pull out of the drive. I'm not sure if they knew I was there alone or not, but I know that after they actually saw me and ran away, they made a choice to come back. This happened several years ago when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. We had been living there for roughly 1 month when. This event occurred several years ago when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. We had been living there for roughly 1 month when this event occurred. My ex was out with work colleagues, and I was home alone. I spent the early evening watching TV and eating takeout. A couple of times, I heard some strange noises, but whenever I would try to zone in on them to figure out what it was, it seemed like it would stop. It got later into the night, and I decided to go upstairs and use a computer for a little while before heading to bed. At this point in time, we hadn't had our phone line installed, and I was still on a pay-as-you-go phone, which had run out of credit. I basically had no way to communicate with anyone while I was in the house for the night. So I'm sitting in the bedroom with only a small table lamp on that barely fanned aglow while I'm typing away on my laptop when I started to hear weird noises again. It started as a light rattling noise, very faint to the point where I had to strain to hear if I was really hearing it or imagining it. I shut my music off and tried to figure out what it was. I went into our bedroom and looked down to the front door, but nobody is there. We had a small yard with a high brick wall and a solid wooden gate with nothing to cast any light. But from what little I could see, there was nothing out back either. I sat back down and switched the music back on. I would say about 10 minutes later, I hear this very eerie screeching sound like metal on metal, again very faint, as if whatever was making it was trying desperately to be quiet. I was getting more than a little freaked out by this point, so I went into our bedroom to retrieve this heavy iron rod that we found in the back of the built-in wardrobe. I didn't switch on any lights as I didn't know what was going on. I didn't want to alert any possible intruder to my location inside the house. Remember, I had no way of calling anyone, and I was getting more than a little concerned that someone might actually be in my house. I headed into the bathroom to see if I could get a better look into the alley that the house backed onto. The office and bedroom, and the bathroom formed an L around the yard, with the bathroom extending further out. I climbed up onto the ledge and inched the window open, trying to see out into the alley. I couldn't see a thing, but the whispering was louder and coming from directly behind my gate. I couldn't hear whole sentences, but I heard enough to summarize whoever these men were, and that they'd seen us move in, and had seen we had quite a lot of valuable equipment like guitars, computers, my DSR TV, game consoles, etc. I imagined they had seen I was home alone, and they were waiting for me to go to sleep to try to get into the house. I stayed perched there for what felt like an eternity, until what seemed like the loudest thud in the world echoed up to me. I guess they grew tired of trying to be stealthy, and one or both of them were throwing themselves at my gate trying to break it down. I could see it shuddering under the blows, and could only imagine how large these men must be. I'm a tiny person, all of a whole 5'3", and at that point, I probably weighed somewhere around 115 oz. As you can imagine, I was white with terror as I watched my gate groan under the stress. I sat clutching that iron rod, just trying to think where I could hide from them. Suddenly, a glaring light blinded me. At first, I panicked and dropped out of sight, thinking they were shining a flashlight at the back of the house. But then I heard barking and shouting. I peeked out again, and I saw the house, which was across the alley from us, had a floodlight installed, and it was illuminating both their own yard, mine, and the alleyway with light. I heard grumbling and cursing, and then 2 sets of footsteps hurrying down the alley. I stayed locked in that bedroom until my ex-boyfriend drunkenly rolled in at about 4 a.m. I didn't sleep a wink that night. And when I went into the yard in the morning, my gate was hanging by one hinge, allowing easy access from the alley. When I looked at the back of it, the keyhole was covered in scratches. This happened well over 10 years ago, so I will try my best to describe the events accurately. One of my childhood homes had a balcony attached to both my mother's bedroom and mine via big double glass doors in each one of our rooms. Next to the balcony are two trees. One I used often climb up and down from the balcony. This balcony faced out to the street. I was a 13-year-old girl at the time of this story. One night when my brother and mother weren't home, I was reading in bed with a very dim reading light. I heard what sounded like something moving in one of the trees outside, but this didn't worry me as possums and bats are common in our area. Now, I had thin curtains covering the glass doors that separated my room and the balcony. As mentioned previously, the doors faced out towards the street where a street lamp light was almost always visible through my curtains. Shortly after hearing the tree rustling noises, I saw a shadow slowly move past the doors, at which point I immediately turned off my reading light and froze like a deer in headlights. The shadow was tall, so it wasn't one of the neighbor kids that I'm friends with. And it wasn't my 5-foot mother. The person moved slowly, creeping as though they were trying not to be noticed. They wouldn't likely be able to see into my room, but I could see them thanks to the street lights behind them, creating a dark silhouette. They moved past my doors out of sight, and I sat there unable to move or even think about what to do other than be absolutely still. That is until I heard another sound. The sound of someone trying to open one of the glass doors. My mom's door to the balcony. I didn't know if she had locked them or not, but I wasn't taking any chances. I moved as quickly and as silently as I could to the bedroom door and locked it. I listened for what the person was doing now, and they were still jiggling the glass door handle, but it sounded like the doors weren't opening. I felt relief, like this person couldn't get in. Surely, all I had to do was wait for them to realize that, and then they would leave, right? Well, I heard light footsteps move back along the balcony to my set of glass doors, until I saw his shadow stop directly in front of them again. I froze, knowing he couldn't see me. He didn't know I could see him, though. I saw a shadow of a hand reach up to my door handle, and my heart stopped. Had I actually locked those doors myself today? I mean, I was out there earlier. What if I forgot? Seconds leading up to him grabbing the handle felt like an eternity. But thankfully, when this person tried to open the door, it did not open. It was locked. I sighed such a sigh of relief. I was worried he had heard it. After this, he began pacing the length of the balcony. I didn't have a mobile phone as my mom thought I was too young to have one yet, and the landline was at the other end of the house. I was too scared to take my eyes off of this person, even to call for help. I was silently crying, with tears falling down my cheeks as I internally prayed that they would just leave. Then I heard him stop moving. He then said, "I could just break the glass, you know." Before I could even process this, I saw car headlights turn around the corner of my street and then stop at our property gate. My mom was home. The person on the balcony moved out of sight, and I heard a loud thump as they jumped off of it. When my mom came inside, I was hysterical, and I was barely coherent in telling her what happened. Eventually, I got the message across, and she called the police. Here is the text formatted and edited for grammar without changing the content. They never found or caught anyone, but a neighbor reported a truck in the street that matched the description of a truck that had been reported recently for attempted child abductions near my school, a block away. Since I walked that short distance daily, the police suspected that he had followed me or seen that I lived there and waited for me to be alone. Some years ago, I lived in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. It's right on the ocean, and it's quite beautiful. There are a lot of bars and places to explore, and the people are very friendly. St. John's has lots of stories, and a long history. There are ghost stories about people who came back as ghosts after shipwrecks. And there are spooky stories of vampires too. You name it. One story everyone tells you about is something called hagging. Apparently, visitors to Newfoundland often experience what is known as hagging, which involves someone falling asleep and waking up with the apparition of someone, usually a demented old woman, on your chest, and the victim cannot move, a phenomenon common with sleep paralysis. Victims, of course, when I heard about it, that's all I thought it was, just sleep paralysis. I mean, what else could it be? After all, sleep paralysis involves not being able to move and often comes with hallucinations. It fit perfectly. That's not it at all. My friends would tell me it's really something different, and I would usually roll my eyes and ignore them. But my assumption was dead wrong. One night, I was going through my usual ritual. I fed the cat, tidied up the house, and made sure the doors were locked. I always did that last, without fail, because there was an old woman in our neighborhood who would sometimes walk around at night yelling. She was harmless, but she was obviously quite ill, and the last thing I wanted was for her to get inside, especially as I lived alone. So I was always very careful about keeping both sets of doors locked. I had 2 sets of doors, in fact. You entered through one set of doors into a mudroom, and then you needed another key to get in through the second set of doors. The second set had a deadbolt, which I always slid into place. So I locked up and read my book, and I began to fall asleep. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I know I was awake as I am now typing this. The moonlight from the window shone through, and in between the window and my bed, I could make out a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat. He was just standing there, and he was mostly in shadow. I could see his details, such as the white cuffs of the shirt and his long hands. I lay there, staring at him. I could even see him breathing in and out. Then, between one blink of my eyes and the next, he disappeared, just like that. He was there 1 second, then gone the next. I shot up from my bed and ran downstairs, only to find both sets of my doors were now unlocked, even though I had just locked them. The deadbolt, though, oddly enough, was still in place. None of it made sense, and I stared at the doors for a long time, almost hyperventilating. If someone broke in and got back out, they wouldn't be able to close the deadbolt inside the house and just get out. I grabbed a baseball bat and turned on all the lights, doing a check of the house, room by room. I even checked the closets. There was no person in the house except for me, of course, but I almost screamed when I walked into the bathroom. My bathroom cabinet, which always faced me, now had the mirror facing toward the shelves. To do that, someone would have to unscrew the mirror from the hinges and rearrange the mirror toward the shelves. I went into my living room and started to sweat. The mirror above my mantelpiece, the heavy mirror that had been there when I moved in, was now turned around so that the glass faced the wall. The top of the mirror was near the ceiling. There's no way someone could heave that heavy mirror into place without a ladder, let alone without making the sound that I would notice. Again, nothing made sense, but I kept trying to make sense of it somehow. I checked all the windows, but they were closed, and they were the kind of windows that roll outward. They can't be opened from the outside unless you break the glass to access the handle, and none of the glass was broken. I didn't call the cops about this. What would I have said? Literally nothing else in my house other than the mirrors were disturbed. Nothing was taken. Instead, I called a local handyman to come and fix my mirrors. He didn't ask questions, though he noted that the mirror was way too heavy for one person to lift. So we had to call in another helper to bring a ladder and to help him turn the mirror back around. I paid him extra, and I thanked him for helping me so promptly. Nothing else strange happened to me in that house, but I never called hagging sleep paralysis again. What I experienced can't be explained away by someone pranking me, or a sleep disorder, or anything else that I can even make sense of. I moved away from Street Johns a year after that. I've not had any other disturbances while sleeping, but I never did figure out what that thing in my bedroom was. I was 14 years old. I was in softball, and I had just got a new bat, and a bat bag to start using. Back then, I used to leave the window unlocked in case one of my friends or my boyfriend wanted to leave me a note. I never locked it, and I never really had a reason to worry about unlocking it until that day. It was 7 p.m. My parents and my sister were out getting something at the store and were to be gone for hours. I was sitting downstairs, watching TV, when I decided to pack my new bat bag. When I was almost finished, I realized I had left my new bat upstairs, and I wanted to pack it so I would not forget it tomorrow. I ran upstairs to my room and grabbed my bat, and as I turned to leave, I heard something. I turned, and I froze. My heart stopped when I saw a man I did not recognize, crawling through my unlocked window. I watched him as he made it into the middle of my room. He reached out for me. I remembered the softball bat in my hand. I closed my eyes and swung as hard as I could. I heard a deafening crack, and then I heard him tumble to the ground. When I opened my eyes, he appeared to be unconscious. I bolted out of my room and down the stairs, twisting my ankle along the way. I dialed 911 as I could, telling the operator what happened. Me being stupid, I hobbled upstairs to check if the man was out cold and to grab my ankle brace. But when I arrived, my room was empty and the window was wide open. When the police arrived, I gave them a brief description of the man. I never got any updates as to whether or not they found him. I got in trouble for unlocking my window, and now I leave it locked, and it's going to stay that way from now on. I'm 16 now, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. If you take anything away from this, remember, lock your windows, and it doesn't hurt to have a baseball bat in your room. I'm a 29-year-old guy who lives alone. I live in a 3-story, 3-bedroom house. It's my childhood home that I inherited through some upsetting circumstances. It's just me, my pit bull bear, and a house that is far from necessary for what we need. I choose to live alone because I'm a solitary individual. Plus, with the life insurance and inheritance I receive, I can live alone comfortably. With that being said, I'm a chef by profession. I work long hours and come home late at night. My brother has a key to the house, but only to let Bear out and to make sure he has food and water if I'm working too late or out of town. You might be thinking, why not have my brother move in? Well, way back in the day when my parents divorced, he went with my mom, and I stayed with my dad. Anyway, my story begins with one of those long nights I spoke of. I informed my brother that I'd be working late and to take care of Bear. He obliged, and all was right. I ended up getting home around 1 o'clock, since the kitchen closes at 12:30, and we had a lot of cleanup to do. I got home, and Bear was there to greet me as usual, happy that I was home. I cooked a quick dinner and headed upstairs to go to bed. Now, when I close down the restaurant, and I know I have to work the next day, I always hang my chef's coat on top of the banister leading up the stairs. This way, when I get up and get ready to leave, I can easily grab it and get going. So, as Bear followed me up the stairs, I placed my coat on the banister. A normal night in, I began drinking because I felt like it. But all the beer was in the fridge in the kitchen. The kitchen being on the 2nd floor and my room on the 3rd. I went ahead and grabbed 4 beers so that I didn't have to go back. I went back to my room and let Bear in. He soon fell asleep on my floor as I drank and watched random YouTube videos of unsolved mysteries and things like that. Once the 4 beers were gone, I kept taking trips back to the fridge, even though I had planned against it. I would just step over Bear and leave the room to get more beer. As I began to become mildly intoxicated, my coat hanging off the banister would startle me when I walked out. Mind you, all the lights in the house are off. I would head up the stairs and see something and be scared for a second, then snap back to reality. This was commonplace, but alcohol makes you forget reality. I would take the second of being scared and then laugh at my own stupidity. It's your coat, dummy. You know this. Why are you so jumpy? I would tell myself. Well, around the end of my 7th beer, I noticed I needed a new one. So I stepped over Bear and headed downstairs. I got my beer and began to ascend back to my room. I'd have made a mental note not to be scared of seeing my coat again at the top of the stairs. Only this time, my coat was not there. I froze. Fear and confusion crippled me. But I thought because I left my door open, Bear got up to look for me and accidentally knocked it down. Then maybe he realized that I would be coming back and went to sleep. I climbed the stairs and my coat wasn't there. I entered my room and Bear was sound asleep, but no coat. I had turned on the hallway light and it wasn't in the hall. At this point, I was on edge. I did one more sweep of the hall and didn't see it. Terrified, I closed my door and locked it, blaming my thought process on the alcohol. Hours after that, I managed to fall asleep. The following day, I had work again. That's why I put my coat on the banister in the first place. So before I left, I needed to find the thing. I searched high and low, but nothing. Then I realized the only place I hadn't looked was my dad's bedroom. I kept the door closed after his passing. I didn't want to go in there. That's the only place it could be, though. So I opened the door for the first time since his passing, and on his bed, neatly folded, mind you, was my coat, ready for me to take. My blood ran cold, and chills flooded over my spine. I couldn't believe it. Did my dad do this? Did something else do this? My house has a security alarm, so I would have known if anyone broke in. So it was just me and Bear. That was only the most recent occurrence. The other one that made me feel this way happened years before, while my dad was still alive. I used to work as an overnight manager at McDonald's. My shift was 10 o'clock p.m. until 6 o'clock a.m., so I would sleep during the day and wake up around 8 o'clock p.m. to get ready. My dad would work nights and was not home until I was getting ready to leave. One summer day, I was sleeping because I had work. I was awakened by Bear barking his head off. I'll preface this by saying, Bear is a rescue dog. He was used in pit bull fighting. So with that, my dog hates other dogs and will only bark when he sees one through the giant front room windows. When his barking woke me up, I figured it was just that. I shouted at him to shut up, which normally does the trick. But this time, he didn't stop. So, I had to get up and go to find him. Once you leave my room, you're in the hall and are immediately facing the staircase that looks directly into the front room. He wasn't at the windows. He was still barking, however. As I stood at the top of the stairs, I had to find him and see what was wrong, all while shouting at him to stop. Once you go down the first flight of stairs, you take a left, and you're in the kitchen. That's where I found him. He was sitting at the top of the stairs that take you to the basement, ears standing straight up, along with all the fur on his body. I was annoyed he woke me up, so I shouted, "What are you barking at, you stupid dog?" That's when I peered into the basement. Against the fireplace was a shadowed figure, which is the only way I can describe it. It was probably 7 feet tall, but definitely the shadow of a man. I froze. Then, when my senses came back, I shouted at the man, "You better get the hell out of my house." I ran to the kitchen drawers and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. When I looked back in the basement, I caught the shadow moving into the laundry room. There's a back door in that room, so I ran down the stairs, ready to defend myself from someone. But no one was there. The back door, in fact, was still dead-bolted, and the handle was locked. I was alone in my house as I had been this whole time. Apparently, the dog and I both saw what was in my house that night. He alerted me to its presence like a good dog. For the first incident mentioned, I continued to live alone here, but I know it's not just the dog and I that live in this house. All of these events spread out across a year, but some of them are ongoing. I've only ever told 2 people this story, mainly because I'm scared to, but also because I'm sort of complicit in the whole thing. Sometimes I feel that if I wasn't so cowardly, I'd have just gone to the police, and the whole ordeal would have been over in less than 24 hours. But that's obviously not what happened, or I wouldn't even be writing this. By November of last year, the whole lockdown thing had me pretty miserable. I hated being stuck in some crummy little apartment. But after a while, I realized this wasn't so much because I hated being stuck indoors. It was more that I just hated the apartment I was living in. So despite it being a terrible time to pack up and move apartments, I decided to look for a new place. I found a place I liked surprisingly quickly, and after a thorough virtual viewing that took place over FaceTime, I offered to put down a deposit. The landlady said I could move in on the first day of December, less than a week from the time I was calling her, and that they were just finishing off a few repairs. It sounded totally legitimate. The lady seemed cool. But when it came to me asking for the contact info of the former tenant, just to get an idea of what I was in for, she told me she didn't have any contact details for him. I was like, what? Well, how did you keep in touch with the guy? She got all flustered and gave me some excuses about having a new phone, which I stupidly swallowed whole because I wanted the apartment so badly. Then, like we agreed, I moved in on the 1st of December, cut to the second week in the apartment. Everything is going awesomely. Electric bills were kinda high, but otherwise, nothing to complain about. Then one night, I'm literally just getting out of the shower when there's a knock at the door. I towel off a little, throw on a robe, walk to the door, and take a look through the peephole. No one. I see absolutely no one at all. Stupidly, I then open the door and look out into the hallway. And the next thing I know, there's a gun in my face, and holding it is a dude in a coveted mask. He and his buddies forced me back into the apartment, and the whole time, like, just take what you want. No one has to get hurt here. I'm cool if you're cool. But the weirdest thing happens. While one of the dudes keeps his gun on me, another one of them walks straight into my bedroom, almost like he knew exactly what he was looking for. One of his buddies follows, and I see this big old sledgehammer in his hand. I start asking what's going on, but the guy with a gun cuts me off and tells me to shut up. So I did. The front door is shut at this point. No one can see what's going on. No one's coming to help me, so I'm scared, but I'm also pretty curious too. That's when I hear these banging sounds coming from the bedroom, sounding exactly like one of them was demolishing some drywall. And as it turns out, that's exactly what they were doing. I hear a few more bangs before one of the guys shouts, "Yeah, boy." There it is, just like you said. The next thing I know, the guys are reappearing with a dusty sports bag in their hands. He unzips it and just sees rolls and rolls of dirty-looking dollar bills. Like there had to be at least $500,000 there, at least. The guy takes one of the rolls out, drops it on the floor in front of me, then says something like, "Get your wall fixed up, bro, and keep the change. But don't tell no one we've been here, otherwise, we come back for you." I just nod. Then they walk out, still wearing their masks, looking as nonchalant as can be. I was shaking way harder than I'm comfortable admitting. Let's just leave it at that. But when I picked up the roll of dirty hundreds and counted them out, there was $10,000 just staring me in the face. If you've never had that kind of cash money on you, it makes you nervous. But I knew I'd be spending it pretty fast on getting my drywall fixed up, as well as other home improvements. The first being a big deadbolt on my apartment door. Back when I was locked up, I read a pamphlet on creative writing. I remember how it said you have to create sympathy between the reader and the subject. If the reader doesn't somehow like the person they're reading about, if they can't find any redeemable qualities, they won't root for them to succeed. And here's where my story is going to fall down. You see, I am not a nice guy. At least I wasn't, because back in the day, I was a career criminal, one who specialized in burglaries, armed robberies, and most pertinent to this story, home invasions. Violent home invasions can be ridiculously profitable, and compared to banks, offices, or warehouse spaces, security is minimal. What's more, me and my firm worked here in England, so it's not like we had some pesky Second Amendment to deal with. Yeah, You still had to worry about have-a-go heroes with their baseball bats and kitchen knives. And I can tell you from personal experience that bread knives leave horrific scars. But unless you were deft enough to target some rich farmer, you could be safe in the knowledge you wouldn't be bringing a knife to a gunfight. On top of that, we carved out a very specific niche when it came to who we targeted, because the people we'd go for were either those with no legal recourse, drug dealers, loan sharks, dodgy builders firms, anyone who'd have a lot of dirty cash on hand, or anything valuable they wouldn't be able to report stolen. But please, don't get it into your heads that I was some weird Robin Hood vigilant, robbing the filthy rich and giving it away. Yeah, we went after heroin and crack dealers, but we got them at home where their families slept. We threatened their kids, little kids, man. We put knives to their arms and legs, told their dads we'd chop them up into little pieces if they didn't give up the cash, or the coke, or whatever we were after. Like I said, we were top scumbags. But here's where the incentive to read on comes in, because I'm sure many of you will be pleased to hear that we got what was coming to us. In fact, I might not live to see 2022, and to explain why, we have to go all the way back to around early April 2015, when a very exciting bit of information made its way through the grapevine to us. So our little firm had 4 blokes in it. Me, who did the lion's share of the planning. Kev, the driver. Scene, who was basically the muscle but definitely had his head screwed on too. And Phil, who brought in the jobs, and who was the closest thing we had to a leader. Phil comes down to the pub one day, and we can tell right away he's got something on his mind. He's all smiles, just orders a Red Bull. And when he sits down in the booth, he's practically rubbing his hands with glee. He then tells us that he had a mate that drove minicabs for a living. And over the previous month, he got in 5 different jobs driving these gorgeous young Eastern European girls out to this big house in Surrey. Clandon Park House, he said its name was. The kind of place you'd call a stately home if it was under the care of the National Trust. But this one wasn't. It was still very much under private ownership, and whoever that owner was seemed to be in the business of bringing some very beautiful, but very vulnerable young women there. Only they never seemed to leave. As this minicab driver said, he never once drove anyone back. He dropped them off, but no one, not from his cab for him anyway, went back to pick them up. This really made our ears perk up. Human trafficking rings don't normally keep a lot of cash on hand, as it's all digital these days. But if one was based in some old big mansion type thing, there had to be some stuff in there with a very high resale value, if you catch my drift. Phil then told us that he'd asked his mate to keep an ear on the ground, basically to make sure something dodgy wasn't going on before we hit the place, but otherwise told us to be on standby for what could be our biggest job yet. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, we get 2 more pieces of info down the tube. Whatever was going on at Clandon Park was definitely something dodgy. The minicab driver had made 2 more trips there over the past few weeks. One of the girls he gave a lift to was definitely a working girl. You'd think this would be the green light for us. If we hit the place around the same time as one of these little visits, the bloke might think it was linked to the girl, maybe the gang running her wanting more than they were owed, and we'd potentially be off the hook. But the second bit of info came with a warning. The minicab driver didn't think we should go ahead with the job, and this is why. The second time he drove a girl up, she hadn't been nearly as excited as the rest of them. He'd said in the past, the girls knew they were in for a payday being driven out to a big posh house in the middle of nowhere. Maybe she'd get a tidy tip or something, maybe pinch a set of diamond earrings, maybe a bit of both. But the last one seemed different. When she got into the minicab, she didn't seem happy or excited. She seemed very, very anxious. When the driver tried to make small talk, she wasn't having any of it. Then at one point, right as they're doing about 60 miles an hour on a busy motorway, she undoes her belt, opens the back door, and just throws herself out of the car. He phones the ambulance, then circles back around to meet them, and was there when they put her on the trolley and put her in the back, dead as a doornail. He said the whole thing scared the life out of him. Said he couldn't stop thinking about what had that girl so scared over her little date up at Clarendon. If he had to guess, he'd say something nasty was going on up there. Something that might make any potential jobs very, very messy. And we didn't do messy. We did fast, violent in and out jobs. We should have just called the whole thing off. But Phil had his mind made up about the place. And since he told the other lads that we might be able to retire on the proceeds, their minds were made up too. Then when we got the news of the vault, it was go time. It had looked like we were just going for the jewelry and the antiques. But when some electrician gave up some info in exchange for a few £100, we had a definite target, and it was all hands to the pump. I used to work as a handyman assistant, and prepping for a home invasion was a lot like prepping for one of those jobs. You assemble the tools you need, sort out a van, make sure everyone knows the job. Then you drive out to the desired destination at the desired place and time. It's quiet too, not like when you're shopping around for a clean shooter, thinking every second person is an undercover copper. I can just pop into B&Q, pick up a sledgehammer and zip ties, and I'll even get a smile from the checkout girl on the way out. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. The jobs, on the other hand, not so simple, and the one at Clarendon Park was the hardest of the lot. The next twist came from when we found out that we'd be going in during the day. If you're thinking home invasion during daylight hours, you must be mad. I thought the exact same thing. I asked Phil if he banged his head or something because the idea of hitting the place at bloody lunchtime was just barmy. Phil told me to trust him, that he'd done the recs or the scouting, and the place was heavy with security at night, whereas during the day there was a changeover of guard shifts at exactly 3 p.m. This is when the guards would be at their sloppiest, which gave us our time to strike. Phil reckoned that we could get in, have the lead fella open the vault for us, and be out again in exactly 12 minutes with millions in cash, jewelry, and whatever else they had hidden in that thing. I'll have to admit, hearing about the vault turned me right back onto the job. I'd been worried about the whole incident with that called girl in the car, but maybe that was just totally unrelated. Maybe the girl was as mad as a box of frogs and was always going to do something like that. Besides, it was all talk of one last job, and we'll be set for life, and in any of those little doubts in the back of your mind just dematerialized. I suppose I've kept you in suspense long enough at this point. I suppose you all just want to know what happened, what went wrong, why I went to prison, and why my life is now in the toilet. Well, it started with the vault. Everything was going perfectly to plan. They obviously didn't expect anyone to actually try and rob the place during the daytime. And the fact that we rolled up right as some gardener bloke turned up to trim the hedges made the help think that we were just part of his crew. She found out pretty quickly how that wasn't the case when Scene broke her collarbone with one swing of his hammer. We managed to grip the head security bloke. It was right where we wanted him to be during the shift changeover. And although he initially insisted that he couldn't get the vault open, threatening to scoop his eye out with the sharp end of a claw hammer soon had him remembering the code. We were expecting lockboxes full of priceless jewelry, maybe some gold bullion, painting, I don't know, rich people stuff. What we found is something unbelievable. I use the word unbelievable because out of all the people I've told, only one person has actually believed me to be telling the truth. But it is the truth. When I saw what it was when we opened that door, what we found was a mix between a prison and a hospital. It was completely sterile, with gowned up and masked up nurses screaming when they saw us walk in with our balaclavas and weapons. There was one main room that looked like a kind of lobby, and 6 smaller cells jutting off from it. We figured that there might be something valuable in the cells, so we went to see what was in there. And I still remember Kev gasping when he saw that it was women. They had a woman locked up in each of these little rooms, and every single one of them was pregnant. The hospital staff, or the wardens, whoever they were, they ran off into another part of the hospital and sealed the door. I doubt we couldn't have gotten the door open, but we weren't really in the mood to try at that point. We realized that there had been a horrible mistake. Yes, there was obviously something valuable in here, but it wasn't anything we could launder or resell. I don't know what exactly was going on, but you just got this sense that something terrible was happening. And this was confirmed when one of the girls got up out of bed, waddled towards the cell door, which was made of some kind of clear plastic, and began banging on it. I haven't got a clue what language she was speaking. It sounded Eastern European, but God knows which one. We didn't need a translator, though. It was blindingly obvious that she wanted us to let her out, and it didn't take us long to find some way of letting her out, but it came with a price. To open up the cells, we had to set off the fire alarm, which meant we had to get out of there without grabbing so much as a crugerant. But not before Kev walked over to the room the nurses had locked themselves in. It had this little glass panel on it, so you could just see inside a bit, but not a lot. Right before we tripped the fire alarm, Kev walks over just to see if there's anything in there worth taking. And all we hear is, "Jesus Christ, boys, what in God's name is all that?" I remember walking over and peering through the little glass panel. The first thing I saw was all those terrified nurses, but behind them, and all these little see-through plastic pouches were babies. Not like actually full-grown kids. No, some of them didn't look all the way grown yet, but you could tell what they were. There was no mistaking it. We then put two and two together, all suddenly coming to the same rough conclusion as to what was happening in there. And that's when Phil flew into a rage. I knew it was stupid of him to try and rescue that pregnant girl. We were the bad guys. You don't do stuff like that when you're a bad guy. It gets you caught. It gets you killed. But what was I going to do? Make him leave her? Phil was about a foot taller than me, so generally speaking, whenever Phil wanted to do something, it got done. On the way out to the van, Scene stopped near these big long curtains. Phil just about tore his head off asking him what in God's name he was thinking. But later, when he saw him pulling out a lighter and set fire to a dusty pair of drapes, he said he just smiled in approval. We piled into the van just before 4 in the afternoon, and I remember that clearly because of the little digi-clock on the dashboard. As Kev turned the van around, I saw smoke coming up from one of the windows, and I remember hoping the place burned to the ground. We drove so fast that I think we're almost back in London before we saw a fire engine zooming past us going the other way. And thankfully, that was the only time we saw blue flashing lights behind us. The pregnant girl apparently didn't know a bit of English and was crying and saying thank you. Thank you over and over again as we drove back. She didn't know much though, only enough to repeat the phrase Tottenham Court Road when we asked her where she lived. We dropped her off. All went our separate ways. Kev got rid of the van, and apparently, that was that. We never had a visit from the coppers with a big key. It took us ages for word of the fire to reach the airwaves, and for all intents and purposes, the raid never bloody happened in the first place. Only we couldn't forget about it, or rather, Kev wouldn't let us. The prick wouldn't shut up about it, worrying about the girls, wanting to try to find the one we'd saved or call in some anonymous tip to the police. And I'm perfectly sure he did too. Calling a tip, I mean. He never told us he did, but I know because Kev was the first one to turn up dead. They said he topped himself, but anyone who knew Kev knew he wasn't like that. He didn't leave a note, didn't tell anyone he was depressed or anything. Phil was next, or rather, if they did get him, his body was never found. They told me he was going to work in Birmingham with another crew or some job he heard about, and that was the last time I spoke to him. His phone was disconnected about a week or so after he got the train up there. I hope he's all right, but part of me knows that he's gone now. I turned myself into the police when they found Scene. Someone had broken into his flat and beat him to death. Scene, big 6-foot-something Scene, amateur boxer Scene. They'd smashed him into the point where he was unrecognizable. If Scene wasn't safe, neither was I. When I first tried to confess to having started the fire, the police told me I had to have been mistaken. Clandon Park had told them that it was an electrical fault in the basement that started the fire, so they basically refused to arrest me for it. I had to tell them almost everything to get them to believe me. Even gave them a rough idea of the van's rake number so they could track it with motorway CCTV. Clarendon Park didn't want to press charges, apparently, not until the police wanted to search the property. Then all of a sudden they were fine with me taking the blame for it. Funny that, isn't it? What I also find funny is how none of it ever appeared in the paper. In fact, on their website, it still says that they had a fire in 2015 and that it was an electrical fault, not an arson attack. But I know what happened. No one believes me, but I know what happened. I got 9 years for arson with a few other convictions tagged onto it, damaging a grade 2 listed building and whatnot. But there was a chance I'd be on 6. I know they tried to have me killed in jail, whoever they are. Some kid appeared on E-Wing around Easter of 2017. No one knew him. No one knew what he was in for. Couldn't have been any older than 18 or 19. Kid tried to shank me up with the sharpened end of a toothbrush. The screws couldn't figure out why. I'd have told them if I thought that they'd believe me. The kid was found dead in his cell not long after, made a new set of a jumper and just did himself in. After that, I knew they wouldn't have another go until I was out, and I just kept my head down and did my time. Now here I am. I've been out of the NIC for a few months now, reading a bed sit. And well, it'd be silly to give that away now, wouldn't it? I've been in touch with the journalist from The Guardian. I tried others, but no one else believed me. If anything happens, this bloke has all the info, and if they make a move on me, he promised to drop the lot of it onto his boss's desk. But all we can do now is wait. Yeah, we'll keep digging for info, keep trying to prove the unprovable. But I know they're closing in on me. I know they can't allow me to live because to whoever is responsible for the horror show on your Clarendon Park house, a few more bodies are nothing to them. This happened a few years ago when I was a college student in Baltimore, Maryland. I found a nice third-floor apartment with 2 friends in a beautiful old building. Being young and naive, we'd often leave the door to our apartment unlocked while we were home, assuming the building's locking entrance door would do the trick. Of course, unless all the tenants made sure to close it entirely on their way out. That door could remain just ajar enough to not lock. Anyone who's lived in a not-so-great area of the city probably knows where this is going. It was really early in the morning, and my housemate had just left for work. I was fast asleep in bed. I'm a small person, and during the winter, I cocoon myself head to toe in a lot of thick comforters. Anyway, the first thing I remember is waking up super groggy to the sound of somebody in my room. It was pretty dark, but I could make out the tall, slim figure of a person who was sort of drifting around by the side of my bedroom. In my half-asleep state, I assumed that it was my housemate. We were close and would often borrow things. An umbrella, a pen, etc. from each other freely, so I figured they were just poking around for something. I promptly emerged from the blanket cocoon and asked in my infamous morning person super cheerful voice, "Can I help you find anything, babe?" The figure turned and jumped about a foot in the air. I realized pretty quickly, with a sinking feeling, that it was not my housemate, but instead some tall man I'd never seen in my life. I then realized that he hadn't even known I was in the bedroom, room, or apartment at all. He muttered something. I think about how he thought this was his friend's apartment, and just kind of stared bewildered. I told him, "Oh no, sorry, this is my apartment." It was very surreal, and I don't think I'd fully realized at that point that I was being robbed. With that, he turned and pretty much bolted out through the living room. I learned about 10 minutes later that he grabbed my laptop on his way out, so at least he managed to find something. Suffice to say, lesson learned. We kept all doors to the place locked at all times from that day forward. My friends and I still laugh about it, but I can't help but think about how it could have been a much worse situation if A, it wasn't just some guy committing a crime of opportunity, and B, I hadn't scared him off with my skills as the world's most considerate home invasion hostess. I lived. I was always broke, and had a few ventures apart from my part-time job to bring me extra money. One of them was house and pet sitting. I've always had a love for animals, so when this couple contacted me to ask a house sit for them for the last few days before they returned from their overseas trip, as the last sitter had bailed on them, their 6-month-old golden retriever puppy would be alone, I jumped at the opportunity. The fact that they promised to pay me the full 2-week fee for staying there less than a week made it even more appealing. Little did I know how bad it would turn out. I got the details, got the keys from the agent, and headed over to the house. As it was already after 5 p.m. and almost dark, being early spring, I got to the house, which was a really nice place, but it bordered on not such a good area that was and still is prone to crime, house break-ins, robberies, etc. It didn't bother me much because, nothing will happen to me. I was young and naive. The first 4 nights went without a hitch, watching movies, jacuzzi, and just generally enjoying myself. The owners would have returned on the 5th day, fairly late at night. I went over to check on the doggo. I got a call from them at about 10 p.m. saying their flight got delayed. They're going to stay in a hotel and do the 3.5-hour drive back the following morning, and asked if I could sleep there again that night, which was fine. I was already there and had my overnight bag still in my car. I called my dad to let him know of my plans as I was still staying with my parents, and he specifically asked what the address was. I normally didn't give them details like that because I was old enough to look after myself, I thought. I still believe to this day that that probably saved my life. I eventually got to bed at 1 a.m. and it felt like I'd only slept 5 minutes when I was awoken to a window breaking, and I could hear movement and what sounded like footsteps running down the hall. The first thing I did was grab my phone and just hit redial. Thanks to my old Motorola phone, redialing was as simple as pressing one button as my dad was the last number that I had called, hoping that he wakes up from the call. I then drop the phone in between the headboard and mattress in case my dad picks up that he can hear what is going on. I had barely done that when the first guy stormed through the bedroom door. I could see his silhouette, and he had a knife in his hand. When he saw me, he raised it and came at me. Number one thing to those that are unfamiliar with South Africa: in the crime, robberies, and house invasions usually are very brutal and violent. People get murdered or tortured if they in the slightest retaliate or don't cooperate with the robbers. Out of instinct, I raised my legs back when he came at me, and when he came within reach, I kicked both legs out as hard as I can. No, I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'3", and at that stage, I weighed about 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, and I was fit and strong. My time not spent at the university or work was at the gym. I could do an easy 250-pound bench, 350-pound squat. When I kicked and made contact with the guy, he completely lifted off the ground and shot into the wall. Luckily, the knife shot out of his hand as well. Before he got the chance to get up, I was on top of him, driving my right knee into his face, and in return, his head into the wall. I knew that my life depended on it, so I put in some extra force. The guy dropped like a sack of potatoes, but before I could get up, I heard the sound of the pistol, and I froze. It felt like all the blood drained from my body, and I became just numb. I remember the only thing that went through my head was that if he shot me, I would rather die than be disabled or dependent on other people that will have to take care of me. He stood like that with a pistol against my head for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 10 seconds. I didn't move, and he eventually said in very broken English to get on the bed face down. I panicked but thought that if he wanted to shoot me that he already would have done so, so I did as he said. He threw a blanket over me, and I turned into a fetal position with my back against the wall, just so that if they wanted to stab me, that I'd have my legs and arms in front to protect my body. By that time, I had forgotten that I had called my dad, and the guy that I need is still down. I heard a third guy come into the room, and I could hear what sounded like Portuguese to me. I couldn't understand what they said, but I recognized it as we used to go to Mozambique on holiday a lot. And that is the main language spoken there. The one guy tried to get the guy that I put down off the ground while the others started to ransack the house, shoving valuables into a huge bag. It was about this time that I heard tires screeching and a car approaching at what sounded like Mach 1. The car skidded to a halt right in front of the gate, and I heard someone scream. It was my dad. The three inside the house panicked and ran out of the back door and tried to jump the fence. My dad opened fire, shooting in their general direction. Now I know my dad missed them on purpose because if he wanted to hit them, he would, as he's not just one of but the best shots that I know. And I'm not just saying that because he's my dad. He is ex-Special Forces, represented in South Africa in the Clay Pigeon World Championships a couple of years ago, has various regional pistol and rifle championship titles, and is a gunsmith by occupation. I have seen him hit golf balls at 50 meters with his pistol. I grabbed the house keys and pressed the gate remote, and my dad called the police while he came in. I met him at the front door, and we walked out to the car to wait there for the police. It took them over an hour to get there, some excuse of no vehicle available. By that time, I had calmed down and started to look for the dog. I couldn't find her anywhere. I grabbed a flashlight from my dad and started scanning the surrounding yard. And as I got to the corner, I could see her laying on the ground. I got to her and saw that she had passed away. Later autopsies revealed that she was poisoned, and the police found pieces of meat laced with poison near the fence. Poisoning is pretty standard practice in my country for dealing with dogs at a house or area that is targeted for a break-in or robbery. I was fuming and so sad. The police were also pretty useless and had a don't care attitude, barely taking our statements. By that time, it was starting to get light, and I retrieved my bag, phone, and locked the house as good as I can without touching anything, and drove home behind my father. Only when I got home, I got the story from my dad's side. He said he answered my call only to hear the shouting and what sounded like fighting going on. And when I didn't respond, he flew out of the house and raced over. Luckily, he asked for the address the previous night, and he knew the area well enough to know exactly which house it was. Now my dad got there pretty quickly, and he said he stayed on the line the whole time, only hanging up when he stopped at the gate. My parents' house is about 10 kilometers or 6 miles from there through a residential area. It normally took about 20 minutes of a drive, and the call duration was 7 minutes and 13 seconds. I met the detective there later that day, gave my statement. They took fingerprints, etc. And the owners got back about the same time. The rest of the day was a blur as I came down from the shock and adrenaline. Now, that is not where the story ends. About 7 or 8 months later, I got a call from the detective telling me they caught the guys, and I must come to a lineup to point them out. I specifically told her that I didn't see any of their faces as it was dark, and after the guy held the gun against my head, I was under the blanket and didn't see anything. She assured me that they caught them on fingerprints and will show them to me beforehand, which might not be the ethically correct way to do it, but they wanted to have as much evidence as possible against them. You will understand why in a minute. I got to the police station, and unlike you see in the movies, there is no one-way glass or separation room. They bring the 3 guys into the room and make them stand against the wall. The one, which I was later told was the leader, which was the one that I had need, looked at me with so much hate as I had never seen in my life. He had the eyes of someone that would slit your throat and not blink an eye. His name was Joseph Dragon. He pulled his hand up to his neck and made the slit my throat gesture. You know which one I mean. We left the room, and the detective gave me a copy of his rap sheet, amongst others. 4 counts of murder, I think, 8 to 9 for attempted murder, multiple assaults, aggravated assault, over 100 cases of house break-ins, robbery, and indecent assault against women. I was shocked. The detective told me that had I not taken him out first and fast that night, I would have definitely not gotten away so lightly. Now, this is also not where the story ends. 3 days later, I get another call from the detective saying that I should be careful as he had escaped from custody, and they had not caught him yet. I was not worried too much as the robbery wasn't at my house, and I had changed cars, so he probably couldn't find me. Also, I got my firearm license and carried my pistol on me 24/7. I didn't hear anything after that until about 2 years later when I saw the detective at the grocery store. We started talking about the case, and she told me that he was killed during a home invasion. He broke into the wrong house, and the owner was waiting for him, pissed. One hand shot him once in the stomach and once in the neck, and thanks to the slow response time of emergency services and police, he bled out on the guy's living room floor, ridding society of a piece of human garbage. When I was 14, I met a guy named James. He was 17. I dated him for 5 years. I'm 30 now. I grew up very poor to a teenage mother. I never met my father till I was 20. I made some pretty bad choices as a young lady. James was a big-time dealer at the time. I found that thrilling and so cool. It was a typical abusive relationship. He cheated on me a lot and physically, mentally, and emotionally abused me. He would then buy me things or give me money to make it all better. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't know any better and had poor self-esteem. His money took me away from my poor home life, so I stayed for 5 years. This happened when I was 17. James and his brother Victor bought a house in a really nice neighborhood. Victor was a single guy, the player type. He had a random girl over visiting that night. James and I were going to bed. It was about midnight. Victor and his new girlfriend left the house and took James's vehicle. James and I were alone in the house. About 2 minutes after Victor left, we heard a knock at the door. James got up and said, "Oh, I must have forgotten his keys. I'll be right back." I'm in bed. I hear James say, "Oh, you have the wrong house, ma'am. Buzz off." He comes running into the room, telling me to close the door as we hear the door getting kicked down. 2 men entered the house. One was wearing a bandana over his face. The other guy I didn't recognize. He wasn't trying to hide his identity. They started kicking down the bedroom door as we did our best to hold our weight against it. We were screaming and begging them to leave. At one point, the bandana guy got his arm and leg through the door, and I made eye contact with him. He dropped this sawed-off shotgun. I reached for it, and he seemed to back off a little bit. The other guy grabbed the gun. Out of fear, I couldn't recognize him, but I felt something in the stare he gave me. We thought maybe they were after money or some sort of contraband. We had no weapons, and all of the illicit stuff was in a separate bedroom. They didn't take anything. It wasn't a robbery. They were there to give someone a beating. James was on the phone with the police the whole time this was happening. The guys took off. It was time to check what they took and hide all of our stuff. The police came, and they noticed a bullet hole in the wall in the bedroom directly beside the room we were in. I found out later it was because bandana guy hid the gun out of the other guy's hand as he tried to shoot me through the door. I went home the next day, completely traumatized, not wanting to tell my family anything that happened. They all gossiped. I walked in the door, and my grandmother knew about the home invasion. My family knew James was a dealer, and they weren't concerned. I thought at the time someone who James knew must have known someone in my family, since she said a female cousin told her. My cousin Anthony's wife called me saying Anthony wants to say sorry, but you weren't supposed to be there. Again, I was dumb and assumed someone in the thug world told them. We lived in a small city, and I was so naive and was convinced it was a robbery from another rival dealer. And that wasn't the case at all. We spent weeks waiting for them to come back. James made sure he had always had a few scary guys with guns in the house. I realize now, but this only adds to my trauma. A few months after this happens, I am at James's house reading the newspaper. I see my cousin Anthony and another guy in the most wanted section. The other guy looked vaguely familiar. Anthony is gang-related. We're the same age and grew up extremely close. although he got locked up at age 13 and has been on and off ever since. Anthony and I would write to each other. We have a strong bond. The phone rings, and a girl named Carly that is completely in love with Victor. But since he's a player, he treats her like crap. She brings up the mug shots in the paper and says, "That's your cousin, right?" She confesses to me that the home invasion was because of her. The other guy in the mug shot liked her and told him how Victor would slap her around. My cousin Anthony was his friend. They made her tell them where Victor lived, and they watched the house until they had seen what they thought was me and James Lee. She was apologizing profusely, begging me not to tell James. I didn't. I knew if I told him, he would have had her shot, and also because it was my cousin. I assumed I would get some blame, or have to show James's thugs where my cousin lived, regardless of what he did. I'm stupidly loyal to family. I saw Anthony had a family function a few years later. He said sorry, and then he loves me, and it wasn't his fault. That was 13 years ago. My life is completely different now. I consider myself an upstanding member of society, but I still feel a lump in my throat when I talk about it. I can't even go to a gun range without having an all-out panic attack. Monterrey, Mexico. I was about 10 years old. If you don't know, Monterrey is actually a pretty crime-infested city. It's beautiful. You just got to know in what spots you are in. All throughout my childhood, I would visit and live in Mexico during the summer so I can be around my family that still lives there to this day. Although the summer of 2009 was the last summer my family would be going there for obvious reasons I'm about to present. So all of my family were my mom's and dad's side. All live in the city called Monterrey in Mexico. I'm sure many of you probably don't know this place, but let's just say it's not the safest city, especially with the drug and crime situation in Mexico at the time. Me and my two brothers, however, never saw it this way, and instead thought more of our cousins and family. We lived in a 2-story house in the regular neighborhood. Nothing fancy or expensive, just normal, I guess. There had always been problems with corrupt police and robberies throughout the night, but I never expected to be a victim of it. One particular night, me and my two brothers, all between the ages of 8 and 12, were home alone with just my mom since my dad had gone out to go drinking with my uncles before the sun set. My mom was already a nervous wreck after supposedly seeing the same white Toyota pass by her house more than a couple of times. My mom took this very seriously due to the fact that her side of the family had fallen victim to a break-in similar to what was happening. However, she did not want to scare us, and just told us that today we had to be going to sleep earlier than usual. My father didn't own a phone and still doesn't, mostly because he's an old traditional type of guy, so my mom couldn't just call him to come home. I was confused as me and my brother Louis looked at each other with a disappointed reaction, as we wanted to stay up later in the living room and play Call of Duty, but my mom wasn't having it and demanded we go to our room early. My oldest brother Mario was soon catching up to the events and even looked a little worried. Now that I remember, we all slept in the same room that night, but we couldn't get any sleep. Midnight rolled around. Then me and my brothers were joking around when suddenly we heard a small creak coming from downstairs. The sound was usually made when the back door was open, since the house was mostly empty and pretty old. You could basically hear anything at a time like night when the house was quiet. Frozen, my brothers and I stayed quiet. "Is that Dad?" Mario asked. But I knew this was not possible since my dad always comes home around morning time since he doesn't drink and drive. What if it's those guys from afternoon? Louis said in a jokingly voice, although I gotta admit my heart dropped at the sound of that. We all stayed quiet to try and hear any noise when all of a sudden we could hear whispers coming from downstairs. We froze in shock as we knew that this was not any of our family members. The more and more we listened, I could make up the voices about 2 or 3 people down there. I had never really felt adrenaline before in my life, but I could feel it with every pump my heart gave. I started thinking of the worst, of those kids that got kidnapped and never returned stories. Then, with a shocking decision, my oldest brother said that he would take a peek. Are you crazy? I said, wanting to shout, but obviously couldn't. Chill out. It's probably just Mom with our uncles or something, he replied. I fear about 20 seconds, which seemed like minutes at the time. He returned. To our horror, he returned pale and shaking so much I had to tell him to calm down. When he finally spoke, his voice was stuttering. He murmured the words, "Guys, there's someone down there." My stomach twisted with those words, and I could feel my heart pumping faster than ever before. We could react. I heard the most bone-chilling scream I had ever heard. The scream was so horrific. At first, I didn't even recognize it was my mother's. In the span of seconds, my mom ran through the hallway into our room and locked the door. I could hear so many footsteps coming up the stairs and rapid movement. I was in shock as I realized what was happening. My brother Louis was crying frantically next to me. My mom threw us in the corner of the room farthest from the door and began trying to open the window. The men were pounding hard at the door, and what I mean hard, I honestly thought that in that moment we were all going to die or get kidnapped. I burst into tears as I saw my mom screaming out at the top of her lungs out the window, calling for help. Never had I heard the sound of despair coming from my mom's voice. From what little I could understand, the men were shouting in Spanish to shut up and things along the lines of break the store down. I must have had a panic attack because all I remember was waking up to the sounds of sirens coming from the end of the block. I could hear the men's footsteps running down the stairs and out the back door. Turns out our neighbor, the Blessed, had seen the group of thugs since the beginning and alerted the cops as soon as they heard them in our backyard. The police searched everywhere, even went on to the next 2 streets. But as we all know, they were long gone. For a long time after, I had nightmares and would have panic attacks when I would hear small voices at night. But as the years went on, so did my fear. My mom has never wanted to go back, and if we ever did, it would be in a hotel. She always says my dad tried to sell the property, but when my uncle went to go check the place out, it had already been broken in, and some stuff was missing. Nothing valuable, but just gives me more reason for never wanting to go back. Mexico can be a fun place, but please do be careful. Sometimes the police officers won't help, so in some situations, you're all alone. All right, buckle up folks, 'cause I've got a wild tale to tell you. So about a month back, I was chilling at home solo. Mom was off at her boyfriend's pad, and Sis was crashing at a friend's for a sleepover. Now, picture this. I'm a 17-year-old dude, just lounging in bed with my pooch, binge watching some forensic files on Netflix. Suddenly, my stomach starts growling, and I'm debating whether to get up and grub. So I shoot a text to my buddy Elliot, asking for his 2 cents. He hits me back with a "yeah, go make some grub." So off I go to cook up some frozen chicken nuggets, my go-to comfort food. Now let me set the scene of my crib for you. My room's next to my mom's on the right, and my sister's room is on the left with a door leading to the living room. As I'm heading down the hallway, I notice something ain't right. The front door is wide open. Now I've got OCD, so I always make sure every door's shut and locked, but I figure Mom must have left it open on her way out. I shrug off the weird feeling and head to the kitchen to preheat the oven. But then, out of nowhere, I hear this loud thud, like someone's banging on a door. Panic mode kicks in, and I scoop up my dog, leash him up, and practically sprint out the door. I shoot a text to my boyfriend, asking him to swing by and pick me up, 'cause I'm convinced someone's lurking in the house, and I don't have wheels. He's down to rescue me, thank goodness. I call up Mom, and she tells me to stay put and dial 911. Oh, I do just that. The operator tells me to hightail it to the neighbor's crib until the cops arrive. Fast forward, and I'm back home chatting with the cops when they haul out this sketchy-looking dude. Tall, wild hair, eyes bulging like he's seen a ghost. Turns out, the dude had been hiding in my sister's room with a knife, planning to rob us blind. He even threatens me as they drag him away. Talk about spine-chilling. I breathe a sigh of relief when my boyfriend finally rolls up the next day. The cops later fill me in that this creep had been casing our place, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. If I hadn't followed my gut and bolted, who knows what could have gone down. Trust me, folks, always listen to your instincts. It was a cold and rainy night, the kind that made you appreciate the warmth and coziness of your own home. My girlfriend Sarah had gone to stay with her mother for a few days. She wasn't feeling well, and I had insisted that she needed the comfort of her childhood home. I was home alone, and the emptiness of the house felt eerie, even with the soft hum of the TV in the background. I had just settled down on the couch with a ball of microwave popcorn when I heard a loud, urgent knocking on the front door. Startled, I paused the TV and looked at the clock. It was already 10:30 p.m. Who could be visiting at this hour? I cautiously made my way to the front door, my heart pounding with unease. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on my doorstep. He was dressed in plain clothes and had a badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. He looked official, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I cautiously opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain lock securely fastened. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice filled with suspicion. The man gave me a practiced smile and spoke with a sense of urgency. "Sir, I'm an undercover police officer, and we've had reports of a break-in nearby. I need to ask you a few questions. Is it all right if I come in?" Alarm bells went off in my head. I'd always been taught to be cautious about letting strangers into my home, especially late at night. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in," I replied firmly. "If you have questions, we can talk right here." The man's smile faded, and he became more insistent. "It's really important, and time is of the essence. I promise I won't take long." I hesitated for a moment, torn between wanting to be helpful and the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I made a quick decision. "Hold on, let me call the police station to verify your identity." I closed the door and quickly dialed the non-emergency number for our local police station. As I waited for someone to pick up, anxiety gnawed at me. The man on my doorstep was still there, no doubt wondering what was taking me so long. A voice answered on the other end, and I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be sent over to verify the man's identity. Feeling somewhat relieved, I returned to the door and told the man that I had called the police station to confirm his status. He seemed unnerved by this and took a step back. I kept the chain lock secured and waited for the officer to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, the tension in the air growing thicker. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. The man on my doorstep must have seen it too, because he turned and hurried away, disappearing into the darkness. The uniformed police officer arrived, and I explained the entire situation to him. He nodded and told me I had made the right call. He confirmed that there had been no reports of any break-ins in the area, and assured me that I had handled the situation correctly. Relieved but still shaken, I thanked the officer and watched as he drove away. I locked and bolted the door, double-checked all the windows, and even called Sarah to let her know what had happened. She urged me to stay vigilant and cautious. The rest of the night was restless. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. What if I had let that man into my home? What had he really wanted? The unanswered questions haunted me as I tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Sarah returned home. I recounted the strange encounter to her, and she shared my unease. We decided to inform the police about the incident just in case. They took our statements and promised to investigate. Weeks passed, and the incident slowly faded from our minds. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, and the emptiness of the house felt less eerie with Sarah by my side. Then one evening, I received a call from the police. They had identified the man who had come to my door that night. He wasn't a police officer at all. He had a history of posing as one to gain access to people's homes. The police had apprehended him, and he was now in custody. The news sent a chill down my spine. I had narrowly escaped a potentially dangerous situation. It was a chilling encounter that served as a stark reminder to always trust my instincts and prioritize my safety, especially when home alone. That night, as Sarah and I locked up the house and settled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of gratitude for her presence and the safety we found in each other's arms. The nightmare had passed, but the lessons it had taught us would remain forever etched in our minds. It was a typical Friday night, and I found myself home alone. I decided to treat myself to a cozy evening. The rain was tapping lightly against the windows as I curled up on the couch with a good book. Around 8:30 p.m., the sound of thunder echoed through the house, and I realized I was getting hungry. Pizza sounded like the perfect comfort food for a rainy night, so I cracked my phone and dialed the local pizzeria. After a brief conversation with the friendly dispatcher, I placed my order and settled back into my book. The estimated delivery time was about 45 minutes, which gave me plenty of time to lose myself in the pages. As the minutes passed, I began to hear the faint rumble of an approaching motorcycle. I figured it was just a neighbor, not giving it much thought. When the doorbell rang, I jumped up slightly startled by the sudden noise. I opened the door to find the pizza delivery guy, a young man with a cap and a pizza box in hand. He greeted me with a warm smile and handed me the pizza, making small talk as I paid. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I thanked him and closed the door, eagerly digging into my delicious pizza. As I savored each bite and continued to read my book, I lost track of time. It must have been an hour or so later when I heard the same motorcycle approaching once again. I frowned, thinking it was unusual for a delivery guy to return. But curiosity got the best of me, and I went to the window to see what was happening. To my shock, it was the same pizza delivery guy, parked his motorcycle and walked up to my doorstep with another pizza box in hand. This time, his friendly smile had morphed into a strange grin. My heart began to race as I opened the door. "Did you order another pizza?" he asked, his tone oddly cheerful. "And no," I stammered, my voice shaky. "I only ordered one." He handed me the second box, still grinning, and insisted it was paid for. I was too nervous to argue, so I took it. But as soon as I closed the door, a sinking feeling overtook me. Something was seriously wrong. I called the pizzeria immediately, wanting to confirm whether they had sent a second pizza or if this was some bizarre prank. The dispatcher on the other end sounded confused and assured me that they hadn't received any new orders from my address. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the unsettling truth. I was alone in my house with a strange man who had somehow duplicated the pizza delivery and showed up at my door a second time. Terrified, I decided to call the police, explaining the bizarre situation. They promised to send an officer right away, instructing me to lock all the doors and windows and stay on the line with them. Anxiously, I waited, glancing out the window and seeing the pizza guy still standing there, now staring intently at my front door. It felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived. They confronted the man outside, and I could hear a heated exchange of words through the closed door. Eventually, they handcuffed him and took him away in their squad car. An officer came inside to take my statement, assuring me that they would investigate further. I learned that this guy had a history of stalking behavior and had been fired from the pizzeria months ago. The relief that washed over me was immense, but the lingering fear of what could have happened that night haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and followed, and I installed security cameras around my home. In the end, it turned out to be a disturbing and chilling encounter with a man who had sinister intentions. I shudder to think about what might have occurred if I hadn't been cautious and called the police. The memory of that rainy night still sends shivers down my spine, a constant reminder that danger can sometimes lurk behind the most ordinary circumstances. It was a chilly, moonless night, and I found myself alone at home. My husband was away on a business trip, and the solitude felt eerie in the silence of our suburban house. I had just settled into bed, wrapping myself in the warmth of the blankets, when my phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the stillness. I glanced at the clock. It read 2 a.m. Who could be calling at this ungodly hour? I thought. Reluctantly, I picked up the phone, feeling a sense of unease creep over me. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. The voice on the other end was low and familiar, sending shivers down my spine. "Did you miss me, darling?" the voice said. My heart leaked into my throat. I knew that voice all too well. It was my ex-boyfriend, Mark. We had parted ways under unpleasant circumstances, and I had hoped never to hear from him again. "How did you get this number?" I demanded, my voice quivering. Mark chuckled, a sinister sound that seemed to ooze through the phone. "I have my ways, sweetheart. I've been watching you, you know." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. The eerie idea that Mark could be watching me filled me with dread. I glanced around the dimly lit room, paranoia consuming me. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice quaking with fear. He went on recounting personal details about my day, mentioning places I had been and things I had done. Panic surged through me, and I realized that he had been spying on me, tracking my every move. Terror began to consume me as Mark continued his unsettling monologue. He spoke about our past, our relationship, and how he believed we were destined to be together. He professed his love, but it was tainted with an eerie obsession. "I'm coming for you, my love," he declared before hanging up. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my mind racing as I contemplated the meaning behind his ominous words. Was he really on his way to my house? I quickly dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. The police promised to send an officer to check on me, but the minutes dragged on, unlike ours, as I blowed in agonizing fear. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows sent me into a state of heightened paranoia. Finally, the doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I rushed to the door and flung it open, relieved to see the uniformed police officer standing there. He assured me that they would patrol the area and offered to stay nearby until morning for my safety. I agreed, grateful for the presence of someone to protect me from Mark's deranged intentions. The rest of the night was spent in a state of vigilance, the officer patiently comforting me while we awaited any sign of Mark. But he never showed. And as dawn broke, the officer left with a stern warning to call immediately if Mark resurfaced. Over the following weeks, I lived in constant fear, looking over my shoulder at every turn. The police were never able to apprehend Mark, and I began to doubt whether I would ever find peace. The chilling encounter had left me traumatized, a prisoner in my own home. It was a quiet Monday evening, and I had settled into my cozy home office, physically working on my laptop. The soft glow of the desk lamp provided a warm contrast to the darkening room as the sun dipped below the horizon. My husband was away on a business trip, and I relished the solitude, finding getting work done. As I was engrossed in my tasks, the faint sound of a knock at the door barely registered. I glanced at the clock. It was already past 7 p.m. Who could be visiting at this hour? I rose from my desk and made my way to the front door, feeling a sense of unease. When I opened the door, I was greeted by an unexpected sight. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood on my doorstep. They looked to be around 10 or 11 years old. The boy spoke up, his voice shaky. "Ma'am, we're really sorry to bother you, but we're trying to get home, and we need $5 for the bus. Can you help us?" My initial suspicion waned as I looked at their earnest faces, and my heart went out to them. I rummaged through my purse and handed them a $5 bill, hoping it would help them on their way. They thanked me profusely, and then the boy hesitated before asking, "Could I use your bathroom, please? It's been a long walk." I considered their request for a moment, torn between being a good Samaritan and the instinctive caution that had always been ingrained in me. Finally, I agreed, leading them down the hall to the bathroom. As they went in, I cracked the door ajar. An hour passed, and I returned to my work, believing that I had done a good deed and that the children were now on their way home. However, as the minutes ticked by, a growing unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It shouldn't have taken them so long in the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check on them. As I approached the bathroom, I heard faint noises from inside, shuffling sounds that made my heart race. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing a scene that sent a chill down my spine. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the evening breeze. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. I had been lured into a trap. Those innocent-looking children had unlocked my window, and now a man was climbing through it, his eyes filled with malice. Before I could react, the intruder was inside my home, blocking my path to the door. Fear and adrenaline coursed through me as I scrambled to find a way out. He moved closer, his intentions clear, and I knew I had to act fast. With a surge of strength, I bolted towards the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the counter, clutching it tightly as I turned to face the intruder. He advanced with a predatory smile, thinking he had the upper hand, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I swung the skillet with all my might, striking him square in the face. He let out a scream of pain and stumbled back, crashing into a chair. It bought me just enough time to make a run for it. I dashed out the back door, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the man cursing and giving chase, but adrenaline fueled my escape. I sprinted through the dimly lit backyard, my breath coming in gasps until I reached my neighbor's house. Pounding on their door, I begged for help, and they quickly called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, and they apprehended the intruder in my backyard. As they arrested him, I watched a mixture of relief and anger coursing through me. It turned out that the children at the door were pawns in a man's sinister plot, used to gain entry into my home. The police assured me that they would be okay, and that they would contact their parents. As for the man, he had a long history of criminal activity. He had several robberies to his credit, 3 of which were violent. I just got lucky that day. I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood seeking a fresh start in life. The past few days had been filled with unpacking boxes and getting used to the unfamiliar surroundings. As I settled into my new home, the sense of isolation began to creep in. It was a peaceful neighborhood, but the unfamiliarity of it all was unsettling. One evening, as the clock ticked towards 11 p.m., I was home alone. My new house felt strange in the dim glow of the living room lamp. I was lounging on the couch, trying to unwind after a long day when the doorbell rang, shattering the silence of the night. I glanced at the clock, puzzled by the late-night visitor. Who on earth could it be at this hour? I cautiously approached the front door and peered through the peephole. On the other side stood a middle-aged man dressed casually. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to open the door, smiling warmly, which put me slightly at ease. "Hey there, neighbor," he greeted, extending his hand for a handshake. "I live just down the street, and I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." I shook his hand and introduced myself. He seemed friendly, and I figured it was a nice gesture to meet someone in the neighborhood. We chatted about the area, and he even shared some helpful tips about living there. But as the conversation continued, something began to feel off. He started asking more personal questions about my work, my daily routines, and whether I lived alone. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Why was he so curious about my life? I began to feel uncomfortable and tried to steer the conversation away from personal topics. However, he persisted, pressing me for information. His friendly demeanor had shifted, and he seemed increasingly fixated on prying into my life. My anxiety grew, and I made an excuse about needing to get up early the next day, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't budge. Instead, he insisted on coming inside for a cup of coffee, which I adamantly declined. As I stepped back from the doorway, I noticed his demeanor change again. His friendly smile had transformed into an unsettling grin. He took a step forward, invading my personal space, and said in a low, menacing voice, "I think I should come in." Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my heart racing. He began to pound on the door, shouting angrily, demanding to be let in. Fear coursed through my veins as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as quickly as my trembling hands would allow. The operator assured me that help was on the way, and I huddled in the corner of my living room, clutching my phone tightly. The man outside continued to bang on the door, growing increasingly agitated. He threatened to break in, his words becoming more menacing with each passing moment. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I could hear the sirens in the distance growing louder, a welcome sound that brought relief. The pounding on the door ceased as the police pulled into my driveway, and the man was apprehended. Turns out the man wasn't a neighbor at all, but a complete stranger who had been lurking in the area. His intentions were unclear, but the terror he had instilled in me that night would linger for a long time. As the police took him away, I felt a wave of gratitude for their swift response, and for my instincts that told me something wasn't right. It was a sunny afternoon, and I found myself at home alone, enjoying the rare tranquility of an empty house. My husband was at work, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet. The only sounds were the chirping birds and the distant hum of lawnmowers from the neighboring yards. I was engrossed in a book when I heard a knock on the front door. Glancing at the clock, I wondered who could be visiting at this time of day. As I approached the door, I could see a teenage boy standing on the porch through the frosted glass window. He wore a tattered t-shirt, jeans, and had a lawnmower parked on the sidewalk. I opened the door, and he greeted me with a friendly smile. "Hi, ma'am," he said politely. "I noticed your lawn could use mowing. I'm trying to earn some extra money. Would you like me to take care of it for you?" I appreciated the initiative and smiled back. "Oh, thank you. I think we're okay for now. My husband usually handles the yard work." The boy nodded, his smile fading slightly, and he stepped back. "All right, no problem. If you change your mind, here's my number." He handed me a small slip of paper with his name, Kyle, and a phone number written on it. I thanked him and closed the door, returning to my book. About an hour later, there was another knock at the door. I got up and opened it, half expecting to see Kyle again. And there he was, holding his lawnmower. "Ma'am, are you sure you don't want your lawn mowed? It'll look great, I promise," he urged. I sighed, realizing that my husband wouldn't be able to get to it for a while. "Okay, Kyle, go ahead. Just make sure not to make too much noise." He grinned and got to work. I watched him from the window as he expertly maneuvered the lawnmower around the yard. He seemed diligent and hardworking, so I decided to go outside and offer him a cold drink. I approached Kyle, who had taken off his earbuds, and handed him a bottle of water. "Thanks for doing this," I said, trying to make small talk. "How long have you been doing lawn care?" He accepted the drink and took a sip before answering. "A few years now. It's a good way to make some cash." I nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. "Well, we appreciate it. Just let me know if you need anything else." Kyle continued to work, and I went back inside, relieved to have found a solution for our overgrown lawn. But as I settled back into my book, a feeling of unease began to gnaw at me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the situation didn't sit right. Eventually, I decided to check on Kyle's progress. When I stepped out onto the porch, I was puzzled to find the lawnmower abandoned in the middle of the yard, with Kyle nowhere in sight. My heart began to race, and I called out, "Kyle, are you okay?" Silence. I approached the lawnmower, my anxiety growing with every step. Then I heard it. A soft, eerie sound coming from inside the house. It was the unmistakable creaking of the staircase. My mind raced as I realized that Kyle must have entered the house without my knowledge. Panic set in, and I had to gather every ounce of courage to ascend the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity. As I reached the top of the staircase, my worst fears were realized. There was Kyle, standing in the hallway, facing the wall with his back to me. He was muttering something incoherent under his breath. "Kyle," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He turned to face me slowly, his eyes vacant and unblinking. His clothes were smeared with dirt and grass stains, and his hands were clenched into fists. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Kyle, you need to leave right now." But instead of responding, he began to advance toward me, his movement slow and deliberate. It was as if he were in a trance, his eyes devoid of recognition. Fear surged through me, and I turned and ran down the stairs as fast as I could, my only thought being to get out of the house. I heard Kyle's heavy footsteps behind me, and I knew I had to make it to the front door before he caught up. I burst through the front door, stumbling out onto the porch, and didn't look back until I had reached the safety of the front yard. Kyle was standing in the doorway, his vacant stare fixed on me. I dialed 911, my trembling fingers struggling to press the buttons on my phone. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, and they assured me that officers were on their way. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept a weary eye on Kyle, who hadn't moved from the doorway. His blank expression never wavered, and it sent shivers down my spine. When the police finally arrived, they detained Kyle and questioned him about his bizarre behavior. He claimed to have no memory of entering the house and appeared genuinely confused about the entire situation. I provided a statement to the police, and they assured me they would investigate further. It was clear that something was seriously wrong with Kyle, and I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and unease as they took him away for evaluation. In the days that followed, I learned that Kyle had a history of mental health issues. He had recently stopped taking his medication, which might have contributed to his erratic behavior. The incident was chilling, a stark reminder of how unpredictable and frightening mental illness can be. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had settled over me. My sense of safety in my own home had been shattered, and I knew it would take time to rebuild. My husband and I took steps to improve our home security, and I couldn't help but wonder how differently things might have ended if I had let my guard down just a bit more that day. Living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, I relished in the solitude it provided. My evenings were quiet, spent reading or watching TV, and it had become a place where I felt safe and secure. Little did I know that one night, that sense of security would be shattered. It was a dark and stormy night, rain pouring down relentlessly. The distant rumble of thunder added to the eerie atmosphere as I curled up on the couch, engrossed in a mystery novel. The sudden sound of my doorbell ringing sent a jolt of surprise through me. Who on earth would be visiting on a night like this? Reluctantly, I got up to answer the door, peering through the peephole. A man, drenched from head to toe, stood on my doorstep. He held a dripping wet Bible in one hand and wore a disheveled, soaked suit. His appearance sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't just leave him out there in the storm. I opened the door, trying to hide my unease. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man smiled warmly, rainwater dripping from his hair. "I'm from the church," he said. "I was passing by when the storm hit, and I got caught in it. I was wondering if I could seek shelter here for a while, and maybe talk to you about our congregation." I hesitated, not entirely comfortable with the idea of inviting a stranger into my home. But his mention of the church made me feel guilty for being distrustful. Besides, it was pouring rain, and he looked miserable. "All right," I said reluctantly. "You can come in, but just for a little while." He thanked me profusely as he stepped inside. I gave him a towel to dry off and offered a seat in the living room. He began talking about the church, its mission, and its community activities. I listened politely, but his presence still made me uneasy. As the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His friendly eyes seemed too intense, and I noticed he was constantly glancing around my house. His questions grew more personal, asking if I lived alone and what my daily routines were like. I began to feel trapped, a creeping sense of dread pulsating within me. I wanted him out of my home, but I didn't want to be impolite. The storm outside continued to rage, and the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he abruptly stood up. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said, with a forced smile. "I should be going now." Relieved, I walked him to the door, my heart pounding. As he stepped back out into the rain, he turned to me and said, "You have a lovely home. I'll be back to visit soon." The words sent a chill down my spine. I quickly locked the door behind him, my mind racing. Who was that man? And why had he really come to my home on such a stormy night? The sense of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided a nightmare. That night, I double-checked all the locks, windows, and security systems in my house. I couldn't shake the fear that he might return, and I wanted to be prepared. Sleep eluded me, and I spent the night on edge, wondering what his true intentions had been. The chilling encounter had left me with a haunting sense of vulnerability, and it was a long time before I felt safe in my own home again. I had just returned from a week-long vacation with some friends, and the exhaustion was starting to set in. My small, cozy apartment had never looked so welcoming. I lugged my suitcase up the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, feeling a familiar sense of relief. The first thing I noticed was the eerie silence. It wasn't a comforting stillness I had expected, but something far more unsettling. The apartment was supposed to be empty. I lived alone, yet as I stood there in the doorway, a wave of dread washed over me. I could sense that something was horribly wrong. I cautiously moved through the dimly lit living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The television was on, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I never left it on when I was away, and I certainly didn't remember it being on when I left for vacation. As I crept further into the apartment, my ears caught a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper, a breath, something that should not have been there. Panic surged within me as I realized I was not alone. There was someone else here, lurking in the shadows of my own home. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. A sudden burst of light revealed a figure standing in the corner, partially hidden behind the curtains. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the intruder. It was a man, a complete stranger, standing there in my apartment. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes, and his unkempt appearance sent shivers down my spine. "What the hell are you doing here?" I managed to stammer, my voice quivering with fear. The man didn't respond. His gaze locked onto me. He looked deranged, unstable, and I had no idea what he was capable of. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Had he broken in while I was away? How did he enter my apartment? I reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers trembling. I needed to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the intruder. I dialed 911 as discreetly as I could and whispered my situation to the operator. The man took a step closer, his gaze never leaving me. I could see the tension in his body, the unpredictability in his eyes. Fear and anger boiled within me as I backed away slowly, keeping the phone to my ear. Just then, the operator's voice crackled through the phone. "The police are on their way. Stay on the line with me," she said. I nodded, relief flooding me at having someone on the other end of the line. But the intruder seemed to sense that time was running out. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged toward me, a manic expression on his face. Pure terror propelled me into action. I sidestepped his attack, narrowly avoiding his grasp, and bolted for the door. As I burst out into the hallway, I heard the intruder shouting behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I raced down the stairs, heart pounding, until I was safely outside. Within minutes, the police arrived, and they quickly apprehended the intruder. It turned out he had broken in while I was away, seeking shelter and food. He was homeless, desperate, and mentally unstable. It was a terrifying encounter, one that left me shaken to my core. Living alone had always been my preference. I cherished the solitude, the freedom to do as I pleased without anyone else's interference. It was a quiet life, but it was my life, and I relished it. Little did I know that one ordinary evening, that life would turn into a living nightmare. In a small town with about 1,000 people, we are located in the deep countryside, and crime just doesn't happen often, apart from the odd stolen bike, etc. I suppose we are quite relaxed about home security, and will often leave the door open all day in summer for the dog to walk in as he pleases, leaving the cars unlocked, and even the house sometimes, never with any problems. Maybe our naivety played a part in this story. It's important to note that my kitchen backs into a public footpath, which in summer is extremely busy with people walking their dogs. They can look straight into the many windows from the footpaths into our kitchen. With the setting explained, I'll get on with the story. I was about 16 at the time, and the story was a couple of years ago. I had taken my dog out for a walk mid-afternoon, like I did every day. I grabbed his lead, locked the door, and took him out for an hour's walk through the fields that surround my house. When I came back, I opened the door, placed the keys on the kitchen table, and went on with my day. Later on, my mother asked if I had seen the kitchen door key, and I explained that I had left it on the table. She went and looked, but it wasn't there. I then doubted myself, thinking maybe I didn't lock the door when I left and dropped it on the walk. Although I was certain I could remember leaving it on the table, I didn't think much about it, assuming it would reappear in the house. If it didn't, I thought I would find it on the walk the next day, as I always walked the same route. A couple of days went by, and the key still wasn't found. I searched the house and my walk route, but it couldn't be found. I found it rather strange, as I recalled putting it on the table, but I assumed I had imagined it, and I must have dropped it. Luckily, we had another key and went on using that key for the door instead. About 4 days after losing my keys, which didn't just have the kitchen door key but also had the front door key, myself and my mom were disrupted from watching TV by our dog, barking like crazy in the kitchen. This was very out of character for him, as he normally barks during the day when people walk past the kitchen. My mom and I went in to find out what upset him, to find the new key had fallen out of the door and was on the floor. This was extremely strange, because we have extremely old doors, since my house is about 200 years old. The keys are very thick, old-fashioned keys, and the only way they can fall out of the door is if you push a key in from the other side, or let you pull it out. My mom and I were a little concerned at this point, but decided we were being silly, so we locked and bolted the door and went to bed. When I got to my room, I locked my bedroom door, as I quite often do to stop my parents from disrupting me in the morning. Thank God I did this night as well. In the next morning, I was awoken by my father shouting he was leaving for work and would lock the door. My mom had already left, so it was just me in. I heard him lock the door, and I tried to go back to sleep. Roughly 10 minutes later, I heard the door being unlocked and opened again, and someone came straight upstairs. I thought nothing of this and assumed my dad had forgotten something. That was until the person walked straight upstairs to my bedroom door and started rattling it forcefully, trying to get it open. I was confused and shouted hello. At this moment, I heard someone sprint from my room and down the stairs, nearly shaking the house. He ran that fast. I knew it wasn't my dad. Now, I jumped out of bed and then locked my door and ran downstairs to make sure my dog was okay. When I got to the stairs, I could see the front door was wide open. I panicked and ran outside to see if I could see anyone, but I couldn't. At this point, I started to cry when it finally occurred to me that someone must have seen my keys on the kitchen table, taken them, and tried to get into my house the night before, but was disturbed by my dog. It didn't make sense to me though, because right next to our front door was my MacBook, a 50-inch TV, and a mobile phone, all in arm's reach, but the person didn't stop at all. They just walked straight up to my room with purpose. I phoned my brother, who came storming around trying to console me. He decided he would take me out to get some food after calming me down as much as he could. When we were about to leave, we made sure all doors downstairs were locked and bolted except the front door, which cannot be bolted. My brother also went upstairs and shut every single door of the rooms upstairs. We went out and came back to find the front door unlocked again. At this point, I was so scared. If once hadn't been enough, we went inside to see again that nothing was stolen. Everything was in its place apart from the laptop and mobile, which we had moved beforehand. We went upstairs to check if anything was gone, to find when we went upstairs, only one door was open, which was, you guessed it, my bedroom. Nothing I could notice was stolen. He could tell someone had looked around, but I couldn't see anything missing. My parents assumed that I must have had a stalker, which I couldn't pinpoint anyone who it could likely be. Being a teenager with red hair, my hair and looks have always given me, and still to this day get me, unwanted attention from many creepy men, which I will put this encounter down to. We changed the locks on all doors and added extra bolts. We have never had any issues since, but I am still terrified to be home alone. It terrifies me to think what the person's intentions were and how persistent he was at breaking in. I'm so glad I had locked my bedroom door that day and the intruder wasn't able to barge in. This happened to me 2 weeks ago. I started university in September and therefore live in a students-only apartment complex. There are 4 other apartments in my hallway, and sometimes we just spend time in each other's apartments. I had the absolute chance, that's ironic, to lose my keys the first week of university. It wasn't a big deal. I simply paid for another key. After a week in my apartment, I started to notice that some of my stuff wasn't in the same place as I thought I'd put it. It didn't scare me because I know I'm a distracted person. On the day of the incident, I was coming home earlier than usual with another student, Thomas, the boy that lives in the apartment next to mine. We got in, and when I unlocked my door, I saw a woman inside my apartment. Of course, it scared me, but as I was about to ask her what the she was doing here, she told me, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know you'd be home so early. I'm the janitor. I clean the rooms weekly." She then smiled at me and went out. I didn't know we had a janitor, but this kind of explained why my stuff was moving. Thomas then noticed that she had left her keys on my desk and said that I should give them back to her. When I took a closer look, I just realized those were my lost keys. The night passed, and I decided to talk to the man in charge of the complex about this. I told him about the janitor that had my lost keys, so I didn't really lose them. And I asked for my money back. He just looked at me in total incomprehension and told me, "But we don't have a janitor." I just froze. Then who went into my apartment for the past few weeks? Why was she still there? We didn't call the police because nothing had been stolen, but I still searched for cameras in my apartment. You never know with these psychopaths. I haven't seen her since then, and I'm glad to know that she can't enter the complex anymore without a badge on the keys. I'm a 17-year-old male living a relatively quiet life in rural northern Montana. I don't party a lot or do stupid stuff, but I do love driving in the mountains. Little did I know this could have cost me my life. It's August of this year, 2020, and I was enjoying some free time on my day off of work, and I decided to go take a drive in the mountains north of Kalispell. I drive a red Nissan Frontier straight out of the Mennonites with a super temperamental transmission for context. The drive there was really uneventful, typical idiot drivers, big diesels, northern highway dreariness. It was a foggy, cold, rainy day, so I figured nobody would be in the mountains at this time, and I would be all alone up there. When I pulled off the main road and up the mountainous dirt road, I felt normal, like nothing was wrong, other than my stupid transmission. I am driving up the road for about 2 hours until I hit a peak and get out to take some pictures, something I usually do for memories. and nothing was really out of the ordinary, and it was silent, other than the wind whistling through the trees and rain. I was truly alone until I got the feeling. You know, that feeling you get in your core when someone or something is looking at you. I was just standing there motionless, listening to any noises that might alert me to someone's presence, but there was absolute stillness. I started slowly walking back to my truck when I heard a loud boom, and a sound like you hear in those old Western movies. My fight or flight was instantly in sixth gear, and I sprinted back to my truck, started it, and by the grace of God, or some higher being, was able to get it into first quickly and sped off. I found a spot big enough and turned the truck around and hauled as much butt as this little four-banger could do back down the mountain road and onto the highway. I drove completely flat out down the highway to the nearest gas station where I stopped. I was pooping bricks at this point because it wasn't hunting season. I didn't see or hear anyone else, and there was no way I could be mistaken for an animal. I get out to see if the truck was damaged at all, and lo and behold, there was a massive bullet hole. I'm gonna guess a 7mm round size hole in the side of my truck. It went in by the rear fender and came out through the tailgate. I immediately called the county sheriff, but since there was no bullet or evidence that they had done it, there wasn't much they could do. Nothing else has really happened since then, and I haven't gone back to that area. This happened a long time ago, so I apologize if some things do not seem clear. I've removed this experience from my memory for reasons that will become obvious, but now I've decided to tell people what happened because I realize it's not something I should hide. Me and my brother Ron were home alone, and we were in my room watching the NFL on TV. We were screaming at the screen whenever our team did something stupid. We were 40 minutes into the game. The quarterbacks were messing around, and out of frustration, Ron slammed his fist into the remote, turning off the television by accident. I said, "What the hell?" and turned the TV back on. As the screen loaded back up, we heard fast-paced footsteps downstairs. Ron and I quickly turned our heads to the bedroom door. I turned down the volume so we could hear the noises more clearly. "I think someone's inside," Ron said. I could hear the stutter in his voice. He was anxious. "No, it's probably just the dog," I replied. Ron, however, was a lot more cautious. He walked over to the door and locked it. Then I realized that the click it made would have alerted the intruder if there was one. At the time, though, I brushed it off as the Jack Russell Terrier, but we heard more footsteps. Ron whispered, "That's not the dog." Ron, being nervous, put me on edge, so I agreed with him, and we turned off the bedroom lights. Ron ran around the room trying to find some sort of object that we could use as a weapon. I sat next to the door with my ear placed on the wall. The doors were thin, so if there was anyone inside the house, I would hear. Nothing happened. It was just dead silence. Ron had his phone ready in case we needed to dial 911. I laid on my chest and looked through the gap under the bedroom door. I didn't notice anything at first, but on closer inspection, I could just barely make out a pair of faded boots down the upstairs hall. I felt my hands shaking as I pushed myself back up to my feet. I tiptoed over to Ron, who was waiting anxiously for information. "Someone's here," I whispered as low as I could. Ron's face went pale, and he stared into nothingness. At one point, I thought he was gonna black out on me. I pulled Ron over to our window. I quietly opened it and looked down to the grass 2 stories below. Ron was still in a different world, as if he blocked himself out from reality, leaving the responsibility to me. I tried not to pay much attention to him, and instead focused on our escape. I took Ron's phone out of his hand as he crouched on the carpet. He had installed one of those apps where only specific fingerprints could enter the phone. I took his hand, which was shockingly cold, and held his pointer finger onto the screen. I jumped out of my skin when the phone let out a loud beep, and all of a sudden, I could hear the footsteps running straight to the bedroom door. I quickly typed in 911 and put one leg out the window. I heard loud thumps on my bedroom door and shouting. He was shouting, "I'm going to kill you." I climbed out the window and landed on the porch roof and shouted back to Ron for him to follow me. Ron stood up quickly and stumbled out the window. He landed on the roof beside me, and I forced the window shut again. "We need to jump," I said. I could hear faint thumping behind the walls. He was struggling to get into our room. I jumped off the porch roof and sprained my ankle. Ron was wobbling on the edge, clearly hesitant. "Quick," I whispered. I avoided shouting because the intruder would have known that we were outside. Ron touched his chest, head, right shoulder, and left shoulder, making the cross, and then he jumped. He rolled when he landed on the ground, and when he got up, he rubbed his neck, and then we ran away. We had run a good 6 blocks before I realized that we had left the dog behind. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice in my jean pocket. I pulled out the phone and heard a woman asking if we were still there. It was the 911 operator. I told her that we needed the cops immediately, and she told us to stay on the line. Then the cops were en route to the house. I burst into tears from what had just happened, but my main concern was for my dog. I talked to the operator as both Ron, and I slowly walked back to the house. We heard the siren and felt weight lifted from our shoulders. I sat in my chair on the porch, with Ron in a squat position beside me. We were both waiting anxiously to come face to face with the intruder. 4 cops came out, but they didn't have the guy. They did, however, have Lewis, my dog. I stood up and took him from the officer, holding him close. I kissed his head and patted his back. I sat back down in the chair and placed Lewis on my lap, still hugging him and apologizing for leaving him behind. The cops explained that there was no one inside, and there was nothing stolen. In fact, they explained that there was nothing that would have proven someone had invaded our property at all. They never found the guy, but I can assure you I haven't had a good night's sleep ever since. Every night I lock my door and keep my dog with me in my room. We installed some CCTV cameras in the house not long after, and ever since, nothing similar has happened. For a little backstory, the legal drinking age in my country is 18. So if you want alcohol and didn't have a fake ID or a parent to get it for you, then you had to wait outside of the off-license, which is like a liquor store for Americans, until someone came by who agreed to go in and purchase the alcohol for you. So we waited around, found someone who was willing to go in and buy our alcohol for us, and got him to purchase a few bottles of vodka for me and a few friends, 2 of which I was with, and the other we were meeting after we'd done this. Now, as it was around 6 p.m., we decided it was too much of a risk to decant our vodka into a less suspicious-looking bottle in the middle of the street, as it was very busy. So we did what we would usually do in this situation, and found a nearby food place to quickly run in and use the bathroom to decant our alcohol so we could be on our merry way. This time we chose to do this in a nearby McDonald's we'd done it in before, so we knew it was a safe bet. So we go into the McDonald's and head straight for the bathroom, as we've done a million times before. As we get into the bathroom, me and my other 2 friends, we'll call them Harriet and Kara, all occupy one cubicle to get the job done and get out and back to our drinking ASAP. As I previously mentioned, we'd done this lots of times before and usually opted to come into this McDonald's as it was usually busy, which meant no one paid attention to 3 teenagers running straight to the toilet without purchasing anything. So anyway, we're all in there doing our thing when I could suddenly hear a lot of shifting and moving above us. I figured it was possibly the air conditioning and opted not to tell my friends as I thought it would freak them out. We get the job done, and as we're about to leave the cubicle, we hear a giggle and a "where the girls off to?" I looked up and see the forehead and eyes of a male who looked to be about 30 just staring out from underneath the tile in the ceiling that he'd slightly lifted. We're all in shock, just staring at this guy who proceeded to giggle down at us and ask our names, where we were going to, and if he could come. We're all in shock because, let's be honest, who really expects there to be some random guy in the ceiling of a McDonald's? Being a teenager who thought I was untouchable, I proceeded to tell the guy that he was a perv and to F right off. The guy seemed to enjoy this and giggled a little more, still shifting around in the ceiling, never taking his eyes off of us. Now, I should probably mention that along with pouring our drinks into other bottles, we pre-rolled a few joints, so we were scared to alert anyone at this point, as we were young and terrified of our parents finding out. The guy, still staring at us, proceeds to ask questions like, "What age are you guys? Where do you live? Can I have some of your drink and smoke of your weed?" Still all the while twitching and fidgeting overhead. He then started to lift the tile, and as we're all stuck in a cubicle with this guy above us, we knew the only way for him to get down was to come down directly on top of us. So we got out of there at that point pretty quickly. We went outside and discussed what we were going to do, and I decided to go back in and alert someone as it's a very busy McDonald's, and I knew that there would be women and children in and out of the toilet until closing time. I didn't want to risk that creep staying up there just to spy on them, especially since I knew he was there and had witnessed his behavior firsthand. So I go in, tell a member of staff that I'd been in the toilet for a long while talking on a phone call. Terrible lie. But my 15 to 16-year-old brain was too scared to tell the truth in case they alerted the police. And that's when the guy had appeared. To my shock, they were completely unsurprised. They were just angry more than anything. I've seen a few male members of staff enter the toilet, and I figured they could handle it from there. So I went on my way. We still went into that McDonald's, but never had any encounters with that bathroom fairy. We're not even sure if the guy got caught, as we didn't hear anything about it afterwards.